It started with a mistake, or perhaps something that was never meant to be found. In the winter of 2003, inside a government warehouse in upstate New York, a young archivist named Eleanor Price was digitizing old asylum records. The job was dull, repetitive, box after box of brittle paper and mildew-stained folders. But then, at the bottom of a mislabeled crate from the long-defunct Pipsy State Asylum, she found something strange, a small, sealed metal box, its hinges rusted shut, unlisted in the official manifest. She pried it open carefully, expecting forgotten payroll receipts or water-damaged ledgers. Instead, she found a single file, case number 734. The folder was thin, yet heavy with something far more unsettling than paper: dread. Almost every line of the document was blacked out, censored by thick bands of ink. The patient's name, family history, medical notes, all obscured. Only one footnote survived, scrawled in fading ink at the bottom by an anonymous physician. It read, "Subject exhibits hereditary Ravenshire melancholia. Epsilon Containment Protocol initiated. Transfer to private institute authorized by Patriarch." There was no record of discharge. No death certificate. No explanation. Just silence. Eleanor's first instinct was confusion, then curiosity. She tried searching for any reference to Epsilon Protocol, or even Ravenshire melancholia. Nothing. Not in any database, not in the asylum's records, not even in classified medical archives. The name Ravenshire appeared only once in the 19th century census, tied to a single estate in the Hudson Valley. It was as if an entire family had been erased from history. Over the next few weeks, Eleanor's casual interest grew into quiet obsession. Every trail she followed led to dead ends, redacted government files, sealed court orders, mysteriously missing newspaper archives. Someone, somewhere, had gone to enormous lengths to bury whatever Case 734 represented. Late one night, scrolling through scanned microfilm, she stumbled across a half-faded obituary from 1898. It mentioned Silas Ravenshire, noted industrialist and philanthropist, and referenced the Ravenshire Institute for Genetic Vigor, a name that would change everything. A sanatorium supposedly dedicated to curing hereditary illness and mental afflictions in the poor. But behind the grand marble facade, whispers persisted of patients who never returned home, of unmarked graves, and of families who were told to forget. For a moment, Eleanor wondered if she was reading a ghost story or a scandal. The more she read, the more it felt like both. When she contacted the State Historical Office, hoping for access to the Institute's surviving records, she was met with an icy silence. A senior clerk told her, politely but firmly, that the Ravenshire estate had retained ownership of all institutional files under private medical confidentiality. Translation: stay away. But Eleanor didn't stay away. She filed an anonymous request through a journalist friend, and what came back made her skin crawl. Among the few declassified fragments was a shipping ledger dated 1874, a list of deliveries to the Ravenshire Institute. Not supplies. Not medicine. Names. Children. Each marked with a strange alphanumeric code beginning with a letter and a number. One stood out: R1-0, Julian Ravenshire. That name, Julian, would later reappear in the most disturbing way imaginable. But for now, Eleanor could only stare at the evidence that this was no ordinary institution. The Ravenshire Institute, it seemed, was founded on two promises. 1, to heal the weak, and 2, to make sure the weak never returned. Newspaper clippings painted a pristine picture: sunlit gardens, smiling patients, speeches about moral progress. Silas Ravenshire himself was hailed as a man ahead of his time, a bridge between charity and science. Yet hidden within that optimism was a single question that would soon unravel the myth of a gilded family. What did they mean by genetic vigor? Because behind a language of progress was an ideology, one that would grow to dominate not only the Institute, but the entire Ravenshire bloodline. And if you believe in curses, this was where it began. To this day, Case 734 remains sealed under court order, its contents classified, and its origin tied directly to the Ravenshire estate. But that one forgotten file, and the woman who found it, would become the key to unlocking one of the darkest chapters in American medical history. The box had been hidden for more than a century, but the ghosts inside it were still very much alive. To understand the horror that would follow, you have to understand the man who built it. Silas Ravenshire was not born a monster. He was born a visionary. In the late 1800s, when America's skyline was climbing higher than its conscience, Silas was one of the men lifting it. A railroad tycoon, a mining magnate, and a self-proclaimed patron of the modern age, the kind of man newspapers loved to call a builder of empires. To the public, he embodied the American dream. But in private, he was haunted by something that no amount of wealth could fix, a sickness he believed ran in his blood. Silas's father had died raving and confused, lost in a fog of dementia. His mother spent decades battling what doctors called melancholia, a deep paralysis of spirit that never lifted. To the world, these were tragedies. To Silas, they were defects, imperfections that he was determined to erase, not only from himself, but from humanity. He once wrote in his personal journal, "Weakness is not a misfortune. It is a contagion, and it must be cured." From that belief grew his life's obsession, the pursuit of genetic perfection. The 1870s were an age of scientific arrogance. New discoveries in biology and heredity had begun to reshape how people saw the human body, and more dangerously, the human soul. Theories like phrenology and eugenics masqueraded as science, promising to map morality by the curve of a skull or the shape of a jaw. And Silas, with his wealth and intellect, saw opportunity in these pseudosciences. He poured millions into research, hiring Europe's most controversial thinkers, men who believed poverty, insanity, and crime were hereditary stains. Together, they developed a theory that would become the foundation of the Ravenshire Institute for Genetic Vigor. Officially, it was a charity. Unofficially, it was an experiment. When the institute opened in 1872, journalists flocked to see it. They described white marble halls, sweeping gardens, and pristine laboratories filled with gleaming brass instruments. Silas, dressed in immaculate black, guided them through the corridors like a benevolent king showing off his kingdom. He spoke passionately about strengthening the nation's moral fiber, about curing hereditary weakness through discipline and modern science. Every word was a masterpiece of persuasion. Behind him stood his wife, Ravenshire, the image of grace, though those who worked in the mansion whispered that she avoided her husband's laboratory like a haunted wing. The institute accepted its first patients that same year, mostly children and young adults from poor families. Their parents, desperate and illiterate, signed forms they didn't understand, handing over full guardianship to the institute in exchange for free treatment. To the wealthy donors, it was philanthropy. To Silas, it was data. Every child became a number, every behavior a test, every failure a justification to go further. The doctors who worked under him, ambitious men eager for prestige, followed his orders without question. They believed they were building a better world, one patient at a time. The irony was cruel. In their pursuit of progress, they became instruments of dehumanization. Silas's private correspondence reveals something chilling. He believed he was saving the human race. "If we are to perfect civilization," he wrote, "we must first perfect the blood that sustains it." To him, mercy was weakness, compassion an obstacle. And when science did not yield the answers he wanted, he created his own rules, his own truth. The Ravenshire Institute became both laboratory and altar, where human imperfection was sacrificed in the name of purity. Yet, even as his empire grew, so did the rot beneath it. Former employees vanished. Local families whispered of children who never came home. But the rumors never reached the papers. The Ravenshire name carried too much power, and too many people owed him too much money. For every voice that tried to question him, 10 more praised his generosity. He funded libraries, hospitals, and scholarships, always in the same breath as his institute's name. Philanthropy was his camouflage, morality his mask. And behind that mask, Silas's true ambition festered, to cleanse not just society, but his own bloodline. His obsession would soon demand a sacrifice closer to home than he ever intended. Because the first patient of the Ravenshire Institute wasn't a stranger. It was someone who shared his last name. From a distance, the Ravenshire Institute for Genetic Vigor looked like salvation. A palace of white marble perched high on the Hudson Valley hills, its reflection glimmering on the river below. Newspapers called it the Cathedral of Modern Medicine. But cathedrals are built for worship, and what Silas Ravenshire worshipped was control. Visitors who crossed the grand iron gates saw only beauty. The sweeping drive lined with elms, the fountains carved from Italian stone, the faint strains of piano music drifting from open windows. To the world, this was the future, a place where science and compassion walked hand in hand. But beauty can be the most effective disguise. Inside, the institute functioned with an almost military precision. Doctors and nurses moved silently through endless white corridors, their shoes muffled by thick carpet. Every surface gleamed, every clock ticked in perfect rhythm. Even the patients, children, young women, laborers, were dressed in immaculate linen uniforms, as if suffering itself had been laundered clean. Each morning began with the ringing of a small brass bell. Breakfast at 7, exercise at 8, observation at 9. The schedule never varied. The precision wasn't for efficiency, it was for obedience. The goal wasn't healing, it was erasure. The patients' letters were screened, their names slowly replaced with identification codes. Their past lives, families, hometowns, memories, were quietly dissolved into the routine of the institute. It wasn't just the body being treated, it was the person being rewritten. Silas designed the institute's architecture himself, and every inch of it served a purpose. Long corridors allowed constant surveillance with minimal staff. Doors locked only from the outside. Hidden observation windows let nurses watch without being seen. The building wasn't a hospital. It was a machine for control, a perfect instrument of silence. Yet to visiting politicians and donors, it was paradise. Silas guided them through sunlit recreation rooms where patients painted or played string quartets for the press. Carefully staged photographs captured cured individuals smiling under the garden pergola, their eyes glazed with the effects of sedation. The reporters, dazzled by the spectacle, wrote glowing headlines. Ravenshire's House of Healing. Science defeats heredity. Not one of them questioned why those same, recovered patients were never seen again. Behind closed doors, the reality was chillingly different. The lower-level staff, nurses, janitors, attendants, worked under suffocating rules. They signed strict confidentiality contracts that threatened ruin if they spoke of what they saw. Conversations in the hallways were forbidden. Questions were discouraged. Even kindness was punished. One nurse, years later, described the atmosphere in a single sentence. You learned very quickly that curiosity was an illness, and sympathy was fatal. Silas's right-hand man, Dr. Elias Stanton, enforced that culture with surgical precision. A loyalist to the core, Stanton handled discipline, patient transfers, and the Institute's more sensitive procedures. To outsiders, he was the image of respectability, polished, courteous, unreadable. But to those beneath him, he was the embodiment of the Institute's true soul, clinical, cold, and utterly without mercy. Every few months, the Institute released success stories to the press. One particularly famous case featured a teenage boy said to have been cured of violent tendencies. The before and after photographs were a masterpiece of propaganda, the first showing a scowling youth in tattered clothes, the second, a serene figure reading in the Institute's garden. The story became a sensation. Donations poured in. No one ever asked what happened to the ones who didn't smile for the camera. Inside the Ravenshire mansion, just beyond the Institute's immaculate lawns, life was equally orchestrated. Silas's wife, Era, hosted lavish soirees for New York's elite, events where crystal chandeliers sparkled and the air hummed with gossip, laughter, and violins. She spoke often of charity, of her husband's noble mission, yet she never set foot inside the facility that funded her luxury. The servants whispered that she avoided the institute not out of ignorance, but out of fear. At night, she would close her balcony windows when the wind carried faint, distant cries from the grounds below. By 1873, the institute had become untouchable, a monument to benevolence. Its reputation so flawless, even government officials deferred to it. The newspapers printed what Silas wanted them to print. The townspeople praised him as a savior. But beneath that spotless marble facade, the cracks were already forming. Strange disappearances among staff. Supply ledgers that didn't add up. Patients who were transferred, but whose files ended abruptly with a single, chilling note. Epsilon Protocol initiated. Few inside the institute dared to ask what that meant. Those who did never asked twice. And so, the illusion held. The marble gleamed. The music played. But the foundations of the Ravenshire empire were soaked in silence, and something far darker was beginning to stir behind those perfect white walls. Because soon, a new doctor was about to arrive. And he would look where no one else dared to look. Every great atrocity begins with a justification. And at the Ravenshire Institute, that justification was written in the language of science. Silas Ravenshire was not content to be a businessman dabbling in medicine. He wanted to be remembered as a reformer, a man who had reshaped human destiny. To do that, he needed not only laboratories and patients, he needed a philosophy. Something that sounded enlightened enough to mask cruelty and reason. That philosophy was purity. In speeches delivered to packed lecture halls, Silas spoke of refining the human strain, of cleansing inherited imperfection. His words were meticulous, never emotional, always rational. He quoted from scholars in Europe who claimed that crime, insanity, and poverty could be traced through bloodlines like a disease. And because Silas wrapped his prejudice in scientific language, people listened. They applauded. They donated. To the public, it sounded humane. Cure the weak, strengthen the next generation. But behind the rhetoric lay something far more sinister, the belief that certain lives were less worthy than others. Within the Institute's classrooms, this doctrine became policy. Doctors and attendants studied charts linking skull shapes to morality, facial angles to intelligence. They learned to read human worth in the curve of a nose or the tilt of an ear. Patients were photographed, measured, and catalogued, not as individuals but as specimens, proof to support an illusion of science. Words became weapons. Treatment meant isolation. Correction meant punishment. And when a patient vanished, their file was stamped with a term that sounded almost clinical in its detachment. Epsilon Protocol initiated. No one outside the inner circle knew what that meant. But everyone understood one thing. Once those words appeared in a record, the patient no longer existed. The genius of Silas's system wasn't only in the cruelty, it was in the paperwork. Every act of violence, every disappearance, was disguised by terminology that stripped away emotion. The staff were trained to speak in codes, to replace empathy with procedure. A young woman suffering from depression might be described as exhibiting melancholic heredity. A boy with seizures as lineage instability. And if they failed to improve, their conditions were noted as non-viable traits. The staff didn't have to feel guilt. They were just following policy. It's a trick as old as authority itself. Dehumanize with words, and the conscience goes quiet. To the outside world, though, the Institute still shone as a miracle of modern progress. Pamphlets printed in New York circulated widely, adorned with phrases like human regeneration through science and restoring strength to the national character. Politicians quoted Silas in speeches. Newspapers lauded his work as the future of medicine. It was a public relations masterpiece. But buried beneath the triumphalist headlines were darker details. Families from working-class towns whispered that their loved ones had been admitted for treatment and never returned. A mother wrote to the local paper begging for news of her son, only to receive a polite letter from the institute informing her that he had been transferred to long-term care for his safety. There was no transfer. There was no safety. Just silence. Silas's charisma was intoxicating. He believed every word he spoke. He had to. To doubt the morality of his mission would mean questioning his entire legacy, and that he could never do. He often hosted private gatherings for the Institute's elite board members, judges, industrialists, academics from Columbia University. In those Camelot meetings, they spoke not of compassion but of efficiency. How to filter out inherited criminality. How to identify undesirable traits in early childhood. How to expand the Institute's methods nationwide. Their language was immaculate, polished, educated, empty of humanity. But every word they spoke paved the road to a quiet genocide, conducted not with guns or chains, but with forms, diagnoses, and signatures. And all the while, Silas's true motive remained deeply personal. He wasn't merely building a system for society, he was building one for himself. A fortress against the fear that his own blood was tainted. The Institute's public image of charity and science hid a darker truth. Its first and most important subject was not an orphan, not a criminal, not a stranger. It was a member of the Ravenshire family. The same name that built the Institute would soon become its first prisoner. In January of 1875, a young physician named Dr. Arthur Beckett arrived at the Ravenshire Institute, his heart pounding with anticipation. He was 32, newly married, freshly published, and utterly convinced he was stepping into the future of medicine. The letter offering him employment had read like a dream, a generous salary, access to the latest equipment, and the rare honor of working under the legendary Silas Ravenshire himself. To a doctor from Boston with more ideals than income, it was an irresistible opportunity. As his carriage climbed the winding road toward the marble gates, Beckett watched the morning mist roll across the valley. The Institute emerged like a temple above the fog, immaculate, symmetrical, perfect. It didn't look like a hospital. It looked like a promise. He couldn't have known that what waited inside would destroy everything he believed about science, morality, and the human soul. The first impression was breathtaking. The entrance hall stretched 3 stories high, sunlight pouring through stained glass that depicted allegories of healing and rebirth. Nurses moved gracefully through the corridors in crisp white uniforms. The faint scent of antiseptic mixed with lavender oil. Every surface gleamed. It felt holy. Silas himself greeted Beckett personally. He was older than his portraits. Thin, elegant, eyes sharp as scalpels. His handshake was firm, his voice measured. "Welcome to the Institute, Doctor. Here, we do not simply treat illness. We perfect the human form." Beckett smiled politely, not yet recognizing the warning buried in that sentence. The first weeks passed in awe. The order, the discipline, the apparent peace, it all felt like a glimpse into medicine's future. Patients appeared calm, their manners impeccable. The staff seemed devoted, their routines flawless. It was, in Beckett's eyes, a triumph of organization. But soon, his curiosity, that dangerous habit of every true scientist, began to stir. He noticed peculiar inconsistencies. The patient files, for example, were not organized by ailment or age, but by an alphanumeric code that made no medical sense. When he asked the Institute's director, Dr. Elias Stanton, about the system, the man smiled thinly and replied, "It's a proprietary method designed by Mr. Ravenshire. You'll find it deficient. Efficient." A word Beckett would come to hate. A few days later, Beckett accompanied a nurse to deliver reports to the West Wing, a long, windowless corridor sealed by heavy oak doors. When he reached for the handle, the nurse froze. "No one goes there," she whispered. "Not without clearance." He laughed awkwardly, thinking she was joking. She wasn't. Even stranger, the staff schedules had no entries for that section. The West Wing didn't appear on blueprints, and its patients, if they existed, were never mentioned in meetings. When Beckett pressed Stanton again, the director's response was chillingly casual. "That area is for long-term containment." Best not to trouble yourself with it. Containment. Another word that sounded sterile until you realized what it meant. One afternoon, a farming couple arrived at the reception hall, asking to see their son, a teenager admitted for violent outbursts. Beckett watched from the staircase as a nurse explained, with rehearsed politeness, that the boy was undergoing quiet therapy and could not be disturbed. The parents pleaded, tears in their eyes, clutching a small parcel of homemade bread. They were dismissed with a smile and a pamphlet. Beckett couldn't shake the look on the mother's face, that terrible mixture of confusion and dread, like someone sensing the truth, but unable to name it. That night, for the first time, he couldn't sleep. The Institute's perfection had begun to feel like a mask. And masks, he knew, were made to hide something. Weeks turned into months. The cracks widened. Beckett discovered a confiscated letter hidden in a file drawer, written by a patient to his sister. It described treatments that sounded more like interrogations and medications that dulled thought and memory. The letter ended abruptly mid-sentence. Attached to it was a handwritten note in Stanton's unmistakable script. Subversive tendencies confirmed. Resistance to therapy indicates dominant trait. Epsilon Protocol accelerated. The phrase struck Beckett like an electric current. He remembered seeing Epsilon Protocol scrawled on that single surviving footnote from the 2003 file, though he could not know that, of course. But now, standing alone in his candlelit office, those words felt like the heartbeat of something monstrous. From that moment, his admiration began to curdle into suspicion. He noticed how the other doctors avoided questions, how the nurses whispered of night transfers, how certain patients vanished between one shift and the next, their files quietly removed. He began keeping a private journal, noting everything, every inconsistency, every vanishing name, every phrase that didn't belong in medicine. He didn't yet realize it, but his investigation had already begun. And the Institute, like a living organism, had already noticed. Every institution has a place it doesn't talk about. At the Ravenshire Institute, that place was the West Wing. From the moment Dr. Beckett first glimpsed its locked corridor, he felt something shift in the air around it, an almost physical weight of silence. No laughter, no footsteps, not even the hum of activity that filled the rest of the building. Just the low whine of the electric lamps and the faint, sterile odor of bleach. The door itself was ordinary enough, oak reinforced with steel hinges, but the guards stationed nearby were not orderlies. They were former soldiers, hired privately by the Ravenshire Estate. And they carried themselves not like protectors, but like sentinels. Whenever Beckett's rounds took him near that hallway, conversation died. The nurses lowered their eyes. The attendants found urgent excuses to be elsewhere. Even Dr. Stanton's usual icy composure hardened further. "Doctor," Stanton said one afternoon, catching Beckett's lingering glance toward the locked corridor. "Your work lies elsewhere. The West Wing is for advanced cases." "Advanced?" Beckett asked carefully. "Chronic," Stanton replied. "Irredeemable. Contagious, in a manner of speaking." He smiled thinly, and that was the end of the discussion. But curiosity is a difficult disease to cure. In the weeks that followed, Beckett began to notice patterns, shadows in the paperwork that pointed directly to the West Wing. The patients marked for long-term containment all shared similar notes: non-responsive, unfit for reintegration, risk to lineage integrity. And each of their files ended the same way, with a single phrase typed neatly at the bottom: Epsilon Protocol initiated. Those words echoed in his mind, growing louder with each day. Late one night, unable to resist any longer, Beckett followed the sound of footsteps down the deserted west corridor. He kept to the shadows, his heart pounding as he approached the locked doors. From behind them came a faint, rhythmic noise, a low metallic thud, like something gently striking iron. He pressed his ear closer. Nothing. Then a whisper. Or perhaps only the wind through the vents. He stepped back quickly when the guard's lantern light flickered around the corner. He slipped into a cleaning closet and held his breath, the smell of ammonia burning his nostrils as boots clicked past. When silence returned, He didn't move for a full minute. Something inside him had changed. He'd crossed an invisible line, not into the West Wing itself, but into the truth that surrounded it. The next morning, during breakfast rounds, he met an elderly patient named Mr. Hollis, a man with trembling hands and a fogged mind, listed as senile melancholia. For weeks, Hollis had barely spoken. But that morning, his eyes cleared for the first time. He gripped Beckett's sleeve with startling strength. "They took him," he whispered. "They took Julian. The name on the wall. The one you can't say." Before Beckett could respond, a nurse appeared, her face pale. "He needs rest," she said, injecting Hollis with a sedative before Beckett could protest. The old man slumped, his mouth falling open mid-sentence. Beckett stood frozen. That single name, Julian, lodged in his mind like a splinter. He knew that name. Every doctor did. It was the name of Silas Ravenshire's younger brother, said to have died in childhood from a fever. But the way Hollis said it, like a secret, not a memory, made Beckett's blood run cold. From then on, the walls of the Institute seemed to close in around him. He began to sense he was being watched. His mail arrived already opened. His notes, locked in his desk, had been subtly rearranged. Stanton's eyes followed him in meetings, calm but knowing. At night, he heard distant sounds that didn't belong: metal scraping, the hiss of machinery, muffled sobs carried through the vents. And always that faint smell. Not antiseptic, not chemical. Something burned. One evening, Beckett lingered after his shift, waiting until the last of the staff had retired. He found a maintenance map of the Institute's lower levels and traced the ventilation lines that led directly beneath the West Wing. There, marked faintly in pencil, was a chamber labeled sublevel furnace room. He stared at the word for a long time. Furnace. Suddenly, the acrid odor in the air made sense. That night, he wrote in his journal, "The West Wing is not treatment. It is finality. I fear that whatever happens behind those doors is not medicine, it is eradication." He didn't yet know how right he was. Because the next discovery would not just confirm his fears, it would reveal the Institute's true purpose, in language so cold and methodical it stripped the humanity from horror itself. The Epsilon Protocol wasn't a medical procedure. It was a sentence. By the spring of 1875, Dr. Arthur Beckett's admiration for the Ravenshire Institute had collapsed into something colder: obsession. He no longer believed in the work. He believed in the lie. And he was determined to understand it. Night after night, after the corridors fell silent, Beckett lingered in the records room with a single candle burning low. He began decoding the Institute's filing system, which seemed designed to confuse anyone outside its inner circle. The letter at the start of each patient's code corresponded not to a diagnosis, but to a family name, often families with several members listed. The following numbers, he realized, weren't random either. They tracked generations. The Institute wasn't just treating individuals. It was mapping bloodlines. The deeper Beckett read, the clearer the pattern became. Terms like standard manifestation, recessive tendency, and trait containment appeared in place of medical language. There were no words like hope or recovery in any of these files, only assessment, elimination, and classification. It was the language of a breeder, not a healer. At first, Beckett wanted to believe it was a misinterpretation, a strange vocabulary adopted by eccentric doctors. But then he found a small stack of forms marked Epsilon Protocol. Each was only a single page, with 3 boxes to be ticked. Non-responsive. Risk of lineage contamination. Requires permanent containment. A person's life could end with 1 inked checkmark. There were no medical notes, no signatures of approval, no official record of death. Just the quiet bureaucratic rhythm of genocide disguised as administration. Beckett began to see how the entire Institute functioned like a well-oiled machine of disappearance. The Epsilon Protocol wasn't a treatment. It was the final step. Patients were transferred to the West Wing, their files removed from the active registry. Their families received polite letters claiming extended recovery. Donations from grateful benefactors rolled in. The illusion remained intact. Evil had never looked so organized. He grew more careful with each passing day. He knew Stanton suspected him. Once, Beckett returned to his office to find his journal misplaced by an inch, just enough to signal a warning. The next day, Stanton visited him. "You're thorough, Doctor," Stanton said with a faint smile, adjusting his spectacles. "A valuable trait. But some curiosities are corrosive to one's peace of mind." Beckett forced a polite laugh. "I only wish to understand our methods." "Understanding," Stanton replied, "is often unnecessary for obedience." It was the calm tone of a man who could have someone erased with a signature. That night, Beckett made a decision. If the Institute hid its truths in language, he would decipher every word. He compared hundreds of reports, reconstructing what the sanitized terminology really meant. Behavioral recalibration equals physical punishment and forced conditioning. Lineage termination assurance equals sterilization. Transition to containment equals disappearance. Epsilon completion equals death. Each phrase was a layer of paint over atrocity. And the brush that painted it was Silas Ravenshire's philosophy: purity through science. The final confirmation came from an old ledger he found hidden in a locked cabinet behind Stanton's office, dated 1868, before the Institute had even opened. Its first entry listed Julian Ravenshire as patient 0. Diagnosis: congenital weakness of spirit and body. Prognosis: risk to bloodline integrity. Julian Ravenshire, Silas's own brother, hadn't died of a fever. He'd been institutionalized, experimented on. And if the code E1 scrawled beside his name meant what Beckett now suspected, subjected to the very first Epsilon Protocol, the realization shook him to his core. The Institute was never about curing the poor. It was built to cleanse the Ravenshire bloodline itself, and the rest of humanity was simply practice. Beckett's hands trembled as he turned the final pages. Each line read like a death sentence disguised as progress. The reports described subjects who resisted treatment, their undesirable traits corrected through surgery, chemical sedation, or termination. There were even notations of behavioral inheritance trials, pairing patients by genetic similarity for controlled breeding. The sheer audacity of it was almost incomprehensible. Silas Ravenshire had turned an entire medical institution into a factory of human engineering, all under the banner of benevolence. By the time Beckett blew out his candle, dawn was bleeding through the frosted windows. He realized that if anyone discovered what he knew, he'd join the names stamped Epsilon before the week was out. But there was no turning back. He'd seen too much. His journal entry that morning was short, almost eerily calm. The language of purity has no grammar for mercy. The Institute has redefined morality into procedure. I must see what lies beyond the West Wing door. The doctor who arrived with hope was gone. What remained was a man ready to expose a monster, or be consumed by it. The night was silent but alive. From the mansion across the valley came faint music, violins and laughter, drifting through the cold January air. The Ravenshire family was hosting their annual charity gala, entertaining the city's elite while their empire of benevolence glowed beneath chandeliers. At the same time, in the darkened corridors of the Institute, Dr. Arthur Beckett prepared to break into the Forbidden Wing. The contrast was obscene: a masquerade above, a mausoleum below. He'd spent weeks studying the building's original blueprints, copied secretly from the municipal archives. He knew the guard rotations, the service routes, even the faulty latch on the storage door that led into the West Wing. As the clock struck 10, Beckett moved. A flashlight in one hand, a stolen key in the other. His heart hammered so violently he feared it would give him away. The marble corridors were empty. The air was cold, stale, metallic. He slipped through the narrow door. And for the first time, he entered the silence. The West Wing was nothing like the rest of the Institute. Gone were the marble floors and polished brass railings. The walls here were bare concrete, the floors slick with disinfectant. Naked bulbs hung from the ceiling, humming with electric tension. The smell of antiseptic was thick, almost chemical. Room after room stretched down the corridor, each one a cell. Heavy steel doors, no interior handles, no windows that opened. Through the small viewing slots, Beckett saw shadows move, or thought he did. He forced himself to look. Inside one cell sat a man, perfectly still, eyes vacant and unfocused. In another, a woman rocked silently, her fingernails worn down to the flesh. These weren't patients. They were survivors of something that had stolen everything from them except breath. He counted at least 12 occupied rooms before reaching a larger chamber marked Advanced Research Laboratory. The door creaked open to reveal a sight that froze him where he stood. It wasn't a laboratory. It was an altar to obsession. An operating table fitted with leather restraints. A collection of calipers and measuring instruments for skull and limb analysis. Charts on the walls labeled indicators of degeneracy. Diagrams of skulls, ears, and eyes. It was here, Beckett realized, that Silas Ravenshire's pseudoscience had been turned into ritual. Human lives measured, categorized, and broken under the guise of progress. And then he saw the shelf. Rows of small wooden boxes, each carefully labeled with a code, the same alphanumeric symbols from the patient files. Inside, Beckett found the most horrifying evidence of all, the personal belongings of the vanished. A brass wedding ring. A child's carved wooden horse. A locket containing a faded photograph. Each one, a fragment of a stolen existence. Further in, a desk. A safe built into the wall, its combination scribbled in faint pencil on the back of a framed portrait of Silas himself. Beckett's hands trembled as he turned the dial, each click echoing like thunder. The safe opened. Inside were several large leather-bound ledgers, thick, heavy, their pages yellowed and brittle. The first was labeled Epsilon Logbook, 1874. He opened it. Each page was a record of a human life reduced to data. Name, age, defects, and disposition. Most ended with a single, merciless word stamped in red, incinerated. The book felt like a tomb. Every page an epitaph. One entry caught his eye. A girl named Eliza M., age 19. Her condition, melancholy and poetic delusions. Her treatment, aversion therapy, unsuccessful. Final action, sterilization performed, March 8, 1874. Epsilon Protocol completed, March 12. For lines to erase a soul. Beckett's hand shook as he turned the next page. The horror wasn't just in the deaths, it was in the calm, bureaucratic precision. This was mass murder by paperwork. And yet, one more name drew him in. One that made his breath catch. Julian Ravenshire. The page was nearly blank. No date of death. No disposition. Just one note, retained for observation. Somewhere down the hall, a sound faint, irregular. A slow, dragging shuffle. Beckett followed it, flashlight trembling in his grip, until he reached the last cell at the end of the corridor. The metal plate above the door was blank. He looked through the viewing slot. At first, he saw only darkness. Then a shape. A figure sitting on a cot, hair long and white, skin almost translucent in the flickering light. The man's eyes lifted, pale and unfocused, but alive. And in that moment Beckett understood. It was Julian Ravenshire, the lost brother, the first patient, the original experiment. He had been kept alive, for decades, within the very walls built to erase him. Their eyes met. The old man's lips moved soundlessly, forming a single word Beckett could read even without hearing it. Silas. Beckett staggered backward, tears burning in his eyes. In that instant, every theory, every file, every abstraction became flesh. He was staring at the price of perfection. He couldn't save Julian that night. There was no way to smuggle out a man who had been erased for half a century. But he could take proof. He slid the Epsilon ledger under his coat, its sharp corners cutting into his ribs, and fled the Institute under cover of darkness. The book was heavy in his hands, not just in weight but in meaning. It wasn't just evidence. It was a book of the dead. And it would soon ignite a scandal that even the Ravenshire dynasty couldn't completely bury. When Dr. Arthur Beckett arrived in New York City, he carried more than a stolen ledger. He carried proof, tangible, irrefutable, sickening proof that one of the wealthiest families in America had turned science into a tool of annihilation. The Epsilon logbook, bound in dark leather and marked with the Ravenshire seal, was filled with meticulous handwriting. Each name, each disposition, each clinical euphemism painted a portrait of horror so complete it could not be denied. Beckett placed it on the desk of a journalist named Thomas Wainwright, a tenacious investigator known for exposing industrial scandals. Wainwright leafed through the pages, his face paling with each turn. "This is a medicine," he whispered. "It's bookkeeping for murder." The next morning, the story broke. Headlines screamed across the city. Eugenics horror in Hudson Valley. The House of Ravenshire and its human experiments. It should have been the end of the dynasty. But the Ravenshires had built an empire not only on wealth, but on connections. The response was swift, strategic, and suffocating. Within 48 hours, the family's lawyers filed injunctions blocking the release of additional documents. Influential editors were contacted, persuaded, and bought. Political allies denounced the report as sensationalist slander. And when facing undeniable evidence, they did what powerful people always do. They changed the story. Silas Ravenshire, they said, was not a villain but a victim. A brilliant man driven mad by grief and obsession. A tragic genius undone by the weight of his own perfectionism. The Institute, they claimed, was the unfortunate product of one man's experimental zeal, not a calculated enterprise of cruelty. The press that had once idolized Silas now pitted him. The public, fascinated by scandal but weary of outrage, accepted the revised narrative. In a quiet civil proceeding, Silas was declared mentally incompetent. His punishment was not prison, but confinement, inside his own creation. The West Wing was swiftly refurbished into a private suite. The cells repainted. The instruments removed. The air scrubbed clean of its stench. The man who had built the cage now lived within it, not as a monster, but as a patient. The irony was immaculate, the justice non-existent. Dr. Elias Stanton, the director who had enforced every order, faced a brief trial for medical malpractice. He served just 2 years in a minimum security facility before disappearing into quiet retirement, reportedly with a pension provided by a Ravenshire trust. None of the Institute's investors, patrons, or board members were ever charged. They had been careful, every signature buried behind layers of bureaucracy, every decision filtered through vague terminology. The machine had protected its architects. As for Beckett, the man who had risked everything to expose it, he quickly discovered that truth is not a shield when it threatens the powerful. Anonymous letters warned him to let the dead rest. His medical license was quietly suspended for improper conduct. Newspapers published stories questioning his mental stability, hinting he was a disgruntled employee seeking fame. The same press that had hailed him as a whistleblower turned him into a pariah. One evening, he returned home to find the door of his apartment ajar and his study ransacked. The message was clear: stop. He did. He moved west, settling in a small Midwestern town, where he practiced family medicine under a false name. He lived quietly, wrote sparingly, and never spoke of the Ravenshire Institute again. But every night, he kept the memory alive, the faces behind the codes, the names erased by ink, and the one man still haunting his dreams, Julian Ravenshire, the ghost in the final cell. The official record closed quickly. The Institute's remaining files accidentally burned in a fire 2 weeks after the scandal. The property was sold off to investors and, within decades, transformed into a liberal arts college. Students now walk those manicured lawns unaware that beneath their feet lie the ashes of hundreds of unnamed souls. The Ravenshire fortune survived intact. Silas's descendants rebranded the family as champions of philanthropy, funding hospitals, sponsoring medical research, endowing universities. They spoke eloquently of ethics, mental health, and genetic understanding. And the world applauded. In the end, The Institute's crimes were not erased, only sanitized. History remembered Silas Ravenshire not as a criminal, but as a cautionary tale, a gifted man who lost himself to his vision. The truth, that his vision was built on the suffering of the powerless, vanished beneath marble plaques and charitable donations. Arthur Beckett's final entry in his private journal, written years later, reads like both confession and curse. I brought light into the darkness, and the darkness swallowed it. The Ravenshire name remains untarnished, but I know what it costs to keep it clean. Evil does not die when exposed. It adapts. It learns the language of virtue. And in that language, polished, modern, respectable, the Ravenshire legacy was reborn. But as Beckett would later say to a young student who once asked why he left New York, because some institutions aren't built to heal. They're built to remember what they've done and make sure the rest of us forget. Time has a way of polishing even the darkest sins. By the mid-20th century, the Ravenshire scandal had faded into a curious footnote in medical history, a controversy, not a crime. The estate, once a fortress of silence, was sold, renovated, and reborn as the campus of a prestigious liberal arts college. The marble halls were repainted, the cells converted into classrooms. Students studied philosophy, art, and science above the buried ashes of those who had been erased. No memorial stood there. No plaque bore their names. Only manicured lawns and the echo of laughter where the screams had once been. The Ravenshire family itself had not vanished. They had simply adapted as all power does. Silas's son, Edmund Ravenshire, quietly rebranded the family fortune through philanthropy. He endowed hospitals, donated to universities, and founded the Raven Foundation for Medical Progress, a name that sounded noble, progressive, untainted. He spoke publicly about human dignity and ethical science. He wrote articles condemning the moral blindness of past generations. He even funded a scholarship in his father's name, the Silas Ravenshire Fellowship for Genetic Research, a gesture so bold it bordered on irony. And the world applauded. In a televised interview from the 1950s, Edmund smiled serenely as he told a journalist, "My father was a visionary who lost his way. Our duty is to carry his light, not his shadow." But the shadow never left. It simply learned to walk in daylight. Behind the Foundation's charitable facade, research quietly continued. New studies in genetics, behavioral prediction, and lineage analysis. The vocabulary had changed, but the obsession hadn't. Words like purity were replaced with optimization. Containment became prevention. Different words, same ambition. By the dawn of the 21st century, the modern Raven Foundation had become one of the most influential voices in global bioethics. Its board included Nobel laureates, CEOs, and public figures. They funded genome editing projects, sponsored conferences on the future of human enhancement, and shaped policies that would decide which lives were worth extending and which weren't. Few remembered that the same fortune once paid for incinerators under the Hudson Valley hills. Fewer cared, because history, when managed carefully, can be rewritten into virtue. In 2003, that illusion cracked, just slightly, when an archivist named Eleanor Price discovered a sealed metal box from the defunct Pipsey State Asylum. Inside was a single case file, number 734, marked with a familiar phrase, "Hereditary Ravenshire Melancholia. Epsilon Containment Protocol initiated." Her discovery reignited an old question that had never been answered. If one file could survive, how many others still lay hidden? Court orders swiftly sealed the document again, citing family privacy. But by then, digital copies had begun circulating quietly among historians and journalists. The Ravenshire name returned to the public consciousness, now whispered not as legend, but as warning. A former board member of the Raven Foundation, when asked about the controversy, laughed dismissively. "Those stories belong to a different era," he said. "We're about progress now." But progress, as history shows, often walks the same path, only dressed in cleaner language. The Ravenshire Institute is gone. Its marble walls replaced by libraries and lecture halls. Yet some nights, when the wind moves through the valley, local groundskeepers swear they hear faint echoes rising from beneath the soil, whispers, footsteps, the clang of a distant metal door. Maybe it's superstition. Maybe it's memory. Either way, the land remembers what men try to forget. Arthur Beckett died quietly in 1912, far from the city and its ghosts. Among his few possessions was a single object, a charred notebook labeled Epsilon. The first page, still legible, carried one final sentence. Memory is the only weapon against forgetting. That same phrase now appears etched at the bottom of a memorial plaque that someone, no one knows who, placed near the old Foundation ruins decades later. It reads simply, "In memory of the erased. May their names outlive the ones who buried them." And so the story of the Ravenshire bloodline comes full circle, from marble to ash, from science to superstition, from silence to the faint murmur of remembrance. Because evil doesn't die. It adapts. It evolves. And sometimes it learns to call itself good.